Conquering conflict within your organization. The learning outcomes in this module include understanding the leadership role in conflict, identify healthy and unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict, how to resolve conflict on social media, and investigating strategies for conquering conflict. I want you to think back for a moment. When was the last time you were involved in a conflict? Again, this is the time where you may want to pause the video just to answer these questions and then continue the module. What did you learn about yourself? And most importantly, have you moved on? Many people are involved with conflicts, but they haven't really moved on. They say, well, I've forgiven, but I'm not going to forget. But then every time you see that person, you're reminded of the conflict. Well, that's not really moving on. However, I can tell you that it's definitely natural. And even in the conflict, we all deserve a time to really heal from whatever the conflict was. Because sometimes a conflict happens at like the worst possible time, and it's not really so much the conflict itself, it's just that one thing is the tipping point. That's what it is. It just becomes the thing that, crashes everything else because it pushes you over that limit that you were already, at. So answer these questions and then proceed to the next slide. When was the last time you were involved in a conflict? What did you learn about yourself? Which is very important. Every conflict that you have, you should learn something about yourself. And have you moved on? Okay, conflict defined. What is conflict? Conflict is a difference that prevents agreement, disagreement between ideas and feelings. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, in my opinion, because it sometimes is a situation in which one or both parties perceive a threat. Now, whether or not the threat is real is another story, but it's all about that perceived threat. I don't like you because I think you're trying to, go after what it is that I want. We want the same thing, and I want you to go after it. And if you think about sports, that is conflict. Both teams want to win. Both teams can't win. Um, but the thing about conflicts is, for everyone there is, you can really learn a lot about yourself and learn some very valuable lessons. And so that's what I'm hoping that you get from this presentation, and also from any conflict that you're involved in. But just remember, it's a difference that prevents agreement, because typically people are after the same thing. Stages of conflict. There are three stages. There's the before the conflict starts, so rumble before the storm. And let me say this: oftentimes a conflict just doesn't happen in a moment. It's some events that lead to that. And again, it goes back to that whole idea of perception. If I'm a member of your organization and we don't get along, there may have been something you did 2 or 3 weeks ago that you don't even realize that you did, or maybe you didn't even do, but it's perception that, hey, um, that I hold that I don't really particularly like this person. May not even mean anything that you did. It's just the way that some people perceive you, for whatever reason. And so conflicts don't just happen. They are definitely planned. I wouldn't say planned, but they're definitely looked at in advance. I mean, it doesn't just all of a sudden appear overnight usually. Then there's during the conflict, the actual storm. So this is when um, it hits the fan, if you will. It's actually happened. And then the last stage is the after the conflict, the aftermath, and the resolution. And you hope that it's a peaceful resolution, or a resolution that both parties can live with. Sometimes it happens, and sometimes it doesn't. But those are the three stages of conflict. Let's talk a little bit about conflict prevention. Now, as I said before, we don't live in a perfect world, but there are some things, some measures you can put up in place that can help minimize conflict, because conflicts can be productive, but then there are some conflicts that are completely non-productive at all. They really impede the mission and the progress of an organization. So the first thing is, I think you have to set up organizational standards. That's very important in the very beginning. Before you even start planning events and doing things, and a lot of times setting up organizational standards is a time to do it. Then during these retreats and other meetings that you have where you're trying to bond with the other members and get to know people. But you want to set up organizational standards. A good example of this would be, so what happens when a member isn't pulling their weight? How do we plan to deal with this as a group? And this way, everyone gets an opinion, and you can have a consensus about what it is you want to do. And so there's no surprise if a person decides, I'm not going to pull my weight in this organization later in the year. They already know what the consequences are. Team building. You have to continue to team build. Team building is not a one deal thing. It's something I believe you have to do during the throughout the year. And I also believe you have to give other people ownership of the team building. So it can't just be the president or vice president or however you structure your organization doing the team building. I think you involve everyone in it, because in student organization, it works like this. You get to a certain point in the school year where everyone's stressed out, and people are bringing in other issues to their meetings. And a lot of times it's not so much, the people at the meeting, it's just the everything else happening, and it triggers sometimes a negative feedback or negative behaviors. Then there's the 5 love languages. Now, let me explain a little bit about what the 5 love languages are. There was a book written by a man named Gary Chapman, Dr. Gary Chapman, who was a marriage counselor for about 30 plus years. And he wrote a book called The 5 Love Languages. You can purchase this book on Amazon, or you can go anywhere to get this book. But at any rate, this book talks about these things that he dubbed the 5 love languages. And the 5 love languages were quality time, words of affirmation, gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. And the reason why this is important, because I think we all have ways that we prefer for people to love us, and then we also have ways that we prefer of how we give love. And oftentimes it's based on what happened to us maybe when we were younger. So maybe, your dad gave you gifts. And so that's how you can tell a person really loves or appreciates you. Now, the reason why I think the 5 love languages is important, why it deals with conflict prevention, is because if you can identify what the love languages are for your members, I think you will be in a better position to get them to buy into what it is you're trying to do, because you've taken the opportunity to get to know them on a very personal level. I think that a lot of times we lose sight of things because we get so busy and inundated with the things that have to get done that we forget that these are people. I know when I was a student leader, there are times that I completely wasn't having fun. I just was focused on getting things done. And so you have to stop and let people know that they're appreciated, because if people don't feel appreciated by what it is that you're doing or being a part of this organization, they're not going to stick around. I mean, I have people that I still talk to this day, I believe, because I showed my appreciation for them. And maybe I showed my appreciation for them at a time when they weren't getting appreciation at their homes. We can never assume that people are getting the affirmation and appreciation from other places. Perhaps in your organization, this is the only time of the day that they get it. And that is a very important thing that you have to always remember. I know that was a long point, but I think that's very, very important for conflict prevention, using the 5 love languages, understanding how people prefer to give and how people prefer to receive. I think you also have to keep in constant communication. When communication breaks down, there's a lot of confusion, and when there's a lot of confusion, people a lot of times make mistakes that don't have to be made, and it leads to that perception that we talked about before. And I think you have to decide what you will do about conflict, just like setting up organizational standards. Organizational standards, nothing more than the code of conduct that the members of the organization come up with. So just like that, you have to decide what you're going to do about conflict. And some conflicts can be handled a very simple way, and others a little bit more complex. So identifying possibilities. I think the first thing is, with any conflict, you have to nip it in the bud as quickly as you can. Because what you don't want to do, you don't want to linger on and fester, because if it lingers on, it just becomes a bigger and bigger issue until they're either an explosion or someone gets their feelings hurt. And while feelings may get hurt, you want to try to salvage relationships as much as possible. You want to keep your ears and eyes open. Conflicts, like I said, do not happen overnight. A lot of times it's something that happened that leads up to it. So you have to be perceptive and know kind of what are some of the things that are happening with my members within the organization. And even if you're not the leader, just kind of keeping your eye open for things. Really getting down to what are the real issues. Sometimes it's not about the person that they're in conflict with. A lot of times it has something to do with something more deeply rooted in something completely different. And mark my words, as the school year goes on, students are getting more frustrated with other things happening in their world. And we don't know what those issues are sometimes. Sometimes it's something happening back home. Sometimes it's something happening academically. Sometimes it's something happening financially. A lot of different reasons. Then you have some people who have motives for inspiring conflict. That's something else to consider. Some people want to intentionally bring about conflict so that they can get a certain desired outcome. And let's just call it what it is. There's some people in your organization who are drama queens, who will purposefully start conflict because they enjoy things in conflict. And then there's the old objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. What I mean by that is sometimes conflicts are right at our doorstep when we don't even know it. We think that, okay, we can address this later. We don't have to deal with this at this moment. But like I said before, as soon as you know that there is a possibility of conflict, it needs to be nipped in the bud before it grows, because if it grows, then it becomes a much bigger issue. Dealing with conflict in social media. Well, it's never a good idea to take conflict to social media. In part because you can never take it back. Once you tweet something, it's out there. You might be able to delete it and all that stuff, but sometimes the damage is already done. I have a Twitter account, but I rarely tweet simply because I want to make sure whatever I say has value. I don't just say things just to say them. Um, it also, when you take your conflict social media, I mean, it really makes you look bad. Forget about the other person for a second. I mean, it makes you look childish and immature. So be an adult and just don't do it. I mean, whatever beef you have with another person, it's something that you and this other person should be able to deal with privately. Or if you're going to deal with it with, the entire organization, do it in a private manner. One of the problems with a lot of organizations is that when they are having problems, people who are not even part of the organization know about it, and it causes more pressure and more issues. As the saying goes, it's too many cooks in the kitchen. Um, because when you got too many cooks in the kitchen, something's not going to turn out right. So keep it in house as much as possible. Once the damage is done, now what? So you've taken this conflict to Twitter or to Facebook, whatever your preferred social media is, and now what? Well, again, what's done is done. So the damage has been done. You have to move on from it. I think the first thing that you can do is offer a sincere apology to that person for what you did. I think every conflict resolution usually begins at identifying what the problem is, but then also maybe an apology or something like that. Communicate. Communicate is very important, and as we know, communication is a two-way process. You can communicate via email, you can communicate texting, you can communicate over the phone, you can communicate in person. It just depends on what you're comfortable with and what the nature of the conflict is. Some conflicts you may not feel safe to do in a in-person one-on-one situation. And let me say this too: some conflicts are at the stage where you probably shouldn't, because there hasn't been enough time to go by to really get a good focus and get both parties to be clear-headed. If the conflict is really fresh and raw and new, maybe meeting in person may not necessarily be, but you still want to communicate. And sometimes communicating, saying something very simple like, "Can I get back to you?" or something like that, will buy you a little bit more time so that you can figure out how you want to deal with the conflict. But you can't ignore it altogether. That's what I'm trying to say here. Do not ignore either the obvious or an opportunity to maybe make things right. Skillfully, as I said before, you have to choose your words carefully. That's what doing it in a very skillful way. What if you said, um, you meant to say what's troubling you, but then instead you said what's wrong with you? Those are two very different phrases, and they can mean two different things. The same thing with texting. I'm not really a fan of dealing with any type of conflict over texting, simply because it's a language all on its own, and not everyone gets what you're saying. It can be interpreted very differently. So I think you have to be very masterful in how you, and particular in how you deal with conflict outside of other means beyond there being some body language involved. I think your communication has to be clear as possible, as plain and simple as you can make it. I think it has to be timely. As I said before, you want to nip it in the bud as soon as possible. If you can't nip it in the bud, you want to definitely acknowledge it and give yourself a little bit more time. And it has to be done effectively, and this sometimes means getting an objective opinion. So I remember, one time I had a conflict with a friend, so I decided to go to someone who had nothing to do with the situation at all, who could look at it in an objective way, who wasn't necessarily going to look at it from the standpoint of favoring me. Because a lot of times we tend to go and get opinions, but the people that we get an opinion from are people who we are friends with or people who are biased, and they can't possibly give you an objective opinion if they're biased. So that's something to consider. So let's talk a little bit about strategies for dealing with conflict. Like I said before, you can do it one-on-one, you can do it in person, you can do, and I recommend when you do it one-on-one, please do it in private. Do not do it in public in front of other people, because there's nothing worse than having to deal with the conflict and then one person being embarrassed in front of other people. It just adds more fuel to the fire. You want to do group, you can do group intervention or discussion. Oh man, I was a part of many of these in my days as a student leader, but also as an administrator. So you can talk about, but never ever gang up on anyone. I mean, you wouldn't want anyone to do that to you, and you shouldn't do it to anyone else. But the discussion, making it turn to a discussion, would be the way to go. And having an organized discussion so that you know how to move on from some aspects of the conversation. Third party, sometimes you may have to get mediation. You may have to get someone. Some institutions offer a mediation service that you can take part of. So that's something that I think is pretty cool if your campus has access to it. If your campus doesn't have access to it, like I said before, maybe you bring in someone from the counseling center to do some mediation, or maybe you get someone who is completely unrelated to the organization to take care of it. In certain communities, they do have mediation organizations that can come in to do some mediation for you. So that's another thing to consider. Goal setting. You want to make sure that whatever conflict you're having, it's not taking you away from your ultimate goal. So if everyone's buying into their one goal, yes, there will be some conflict along the way, but that conflict should never derail you from what it is that you all want to achieve. Common benefits. What are some common benefits of dealing with the conflict? You know, what do we stand to gain as a unit if we deal with this conflict? So find that common ground. Man, you know, this doesn't make any sense for us to continue to argue about this. We both essentially want the same thing. Can we compromise on this? And then, or else, if you don't deal with conflict, again, it's going to be a much bigger monster to deal with down the road. It may involve losing members, good members. It may involve having your reputation or organization take a hit, a lot of different things. So think about it for a second, and this may be the opportunity for you to pause the video. You are president of your organization. Two members are not getting along at all, so they hate each other. And for all intent and purposes, this may be an actual scenario happening in your organization right now. What do you do? I want you to write down three possible solutions. Three possible solutions. There's a train again. It's coming. At any rate, leadership role in conflict. Let's talk a little bit about that. I think as leaders, you have a particular role in conflict that's very different than other members, because you are looked at differently than everyone else. So There has to be some prevention through good organizational culture, training, and education. Like I said before, if you guys get together at the beginning of the school year and decide to put some training together that can talk about the what if scenarios of what if we do run into a conflict, how do we deal with this? I think that is a good example of good organizational training to meet the challenge before it becomes a huge, huge problem. I think you have to be proactive and responsive to complaints. You can't just ignore things. I mean, some of this stuff to some degree is common sense. You have to take all reasonable steps necessary to prevent it. Now, again, you're not going to prevent all conflicts, and not all conflict have to necessarily be negative. There's a lot of good things that can cause conflicts, but as a leader, you have to figure out how you can shape it and how you can utilize it to make the organization better. I think you have to be prompt and thorough and effective in investigations. You cannot be impartial, which goes to the point of don't ever play favorites. And even if you're not trying to, sometimes people can perceive that you're playing favorites. So you have to be very, very careful. And you have to have appropriate follow through. So you can't just pick it up one day and then don't even deal with it and pretend like it has resolved itself, because sometimes it has not resolved itself. A positive force and being a is going to always long, long way. Everyone can choose to be negative, but that doesn't make anything better. So people have to be, you have to be positive, particularly when you're the leader, because people are looking at you. You have to communicate effectively. Like I said, in a very clear, concise way, and without taking it to social media or even texting it. Uphold performance standards. Model appropriate workplace conduct. Now, when I say workplace, I understand that your organization is not a job, but you have to exhibit a level of professionalism, and you have to filter issues to determine what needs to be raised. So, which ones are really worth addressing? Because every conflict doesn't need to take an entire meeting to address, or doesn't need to take a whole lot of energy. It can be dealt with relatively quickly. Being a positive force and influence, here are a couple of things to remember: that you are the face of the organization. If you are the president or vice president, anyone that's on the executive board, you are the face of the organization. Negative attitude interactions reflect on the entire organization. So if you have a negative attitude about this, the whole organization is going to look a particular way. And most member disputes can be dealt with early or avoided through positive communication, which is why I always advise people to take the opportunity to do some type of team builder at the beginning of meetings, because I think they set the tone for many of the meetings. Even if a person's coming in with a lot of baggage, it can maybe set the tone and change things a bit. Let's talk a little bit about unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict. So, an inability to recognize and respond. So you basically don't like conflict, so you're going to choose to not respond to it at all, or to even look the other way and pretend like it doesn't exist. Then you have the complete opposite reactions to it. You can get angry, and you can be explosive and have resentful reactions. That's never a good way to handle it, because people will lose respect for you very, very quickly when you exhibit those types of behaviors. The expectation of bad outcomes. This is also another negative way to deal with it, when you just think that there's no good that can come out of this. Yes, there are some conflicts that are pretty messy and pretty ugly, but I think most of them you'll find that something good will come out of it. So you have to be hopeful in your expectations. The other part of this is you cannot give emotion an untimely reaction. So in other words, you never react to something in the moment. Never. Because sometimes it can get something so unfiltered and so raw. So you want to take an opportunity to pause before you respond. And sometimes that may mean, hey, I'll answer that question, but let me just take a quick bathroom break, or give me one moment and I'll respond in just a second because I don't want to shoot off at the mouth. And in most cases, people will respect that. That's the key. That's the key. You don't want to ever be caught in a position where you're unguarded or unable to really be able to say what you need to say. And then there's avoidance of conflict or deferment. Like I said, it's just like the inability to recognize and respond to it. I'm just not going to deal with it at all, or I'm going to pass this on to someone else that has nothing to do with it. All are unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict. Let's talk a little bit about healthy ways of addressing conflict. Having the capacity to recognize and respond in a timely manner. Like I said, tactful and timeliness are very, very important. A willingness to forgive, move on, and learn. One of the first things I asked you at the beginning of this module was, have you moved on? And really mean that, have you moved on? Because if you don't move on from it, you're going to not see other possibilities that may be there for you. The ability to seek compromise and avoid penalty. And what I mean by penalty is, the negative things that come along with the lack of addressing the conflict. So you have to be willing to compromise. And sometimes that compromise means 60-40. It isn't always 50-50. Two people don't always get equally what they want. Sometimes that's the way it happens. Sometimes you have to be the bigger person. And then another healthy way of dealing with it is the belief that resolution can support the interests of both parties. Like I said, the compromise. So let's talk a little bit about the conflict aftermath here. What's the worst case scenario? I think whenever you're thinking about a conflict, you got to think about what is the worst case scenario. Sometimes it's our fear and it's our imaginations that run wild. It's never as bad as people make it out to be. When you watch the news, many things are sensationalized where you're thinking, wow, I don't know how people are going to be able to deal with this or deal with that. Well, people do. People do. So sometimes just looking at it from a standpoint of what's the worst case scenario, you realize that, wait a minute, I really don't have anything to fear, because if this is the worst case scenario, then I probably will be okay. Conflict, I think is important for you to document, because there are conflicts that get to a certain point where, hey, it may go to the courts, or it may go to a third party involved in the particular conflict. Using it as a teachable moment. Conflicts are always about, what can I learn as what can I learn from this? How can this make me better, a better leader? And then forgiving but don't forgetting. I've struggled with forgiveness over my life, but when I have forgiven people, I've never forgotten about it. And so I think it makes me wiser, but you have to forgive, even though it's, to me, probably one of the toughest things that people can do is to say, I'm sorry, or just to forgive someone else. So let's talk a little bit about conflict assessment. And this will be a great time for you to pause the video just to answer the questions. So the first question is, how do you plan to deal with conflict in the future? So based on everything that we've talked about in this presentation, how do you plan to deal with conflict in the future? What lessons have you learned from past experiences? So everyone at some point in their life has dealt with conflict, but what lessons have you learned from past experiences? What do you dislike the most about conflict? And conversely, what do you like the most about conflict? And I think taking the positive negative approach to conflict, because conflict oftentimes does have a positive negative, you begin to kind of see it for what it is. But I want you to answer those 4 questions and answer them truthfully and as to the best of your ability. And I think you'll be very surprised with some of the answers you come up with. So here are the key points for this module. All conflicts can be a learning experience. All of them. If you choose to see it that way. All conflicts have 3 stages. There's the rumble before the storm, there's the storm, and then of course there is the aftermath or resolution of the conflict. And knowing which stage you're in will inform how you plan to go about handling it. If you're in the rumbling stages, the beginning stages, you may opt for a quick, swift approach. If you're in a storm, you may have to become a little bit more creative in how you plan to deal with it. And then if you're in the resolution stage of it, you have to be willing to move on. You have to deal with it, but then you have to be willing to move on. As a leader, you must resolve conflict quickly, tactfully, and impartially. So the key word here is being impartial. You cannot play favorites. I repeat, you cannot play favorites if you are a leader. And if you don't feel comfortable with handling this conflict, then sometimes you may bring in a mediator to handle it for you. And just tell them, listen, I don't feel comfortable because I know you both very well, and I don't want to seem like I'm playing favorites. So I've opted to bring in a third-party mediator and this person, that's what they do for a living, in order to resolve this issue. And I think that sort of lets you off the hook, but it also shows a level of maturity to see that, hey, I don't have all the tools in my toolbox in order to deal with this. I have to take this to another source. And then never take conflict to social media, which for some people that seems like common sense, but remember, sense isn't always common these days. So when you take it to social media, you forever leave a scar that's going to always be there if you're not careful. So what are some of the action steps? What are your goals for your continued learning? What are 3 resources in my environment I have access to? I told you about the mediation person. Maybe that's a resource. Or 2 colleagues I can tap for support while striving to achieve this goal. If you're the president, maybe you need to talk to your advisor and your vice president of how you can achieve this goal. Of course, assuming that you're not in conflict with your vice president. And then what action step can you take in the next week? What can you do in order to ratify this situation, or should I say, really nip the situation in the bud? So that being said, guys, I want to thank you for listening to this module and again, investing in yourself. Conflict is never easy, but there is some real good that can come out of conflict. So just remember that, and good luck again, and I'll see you in the next module. Take care.